Then you can move over to sort of what I consider more of the sort of self-identification of your company, the branding of your product, and where those things intersect, as many of you have probably read in the news, causes a lot of lawsuits between companies and between consumers and companies. So it also is sort of just really interesting from a consumer perspective, being in the grocery store or at a restaurant and what you're ordering. So just a few sort of examples that I found interesting in terms of like the branding of food. So for years, prunes, anyone eaten a prune before, right? Maybe not. Maybe you think, wow, I would never eat prunes. Those are for senior citizens. But back in 2000, the California Prune Council, I think is what, the Prune Board, decided that prunes sort of had a bad name, and they were not selling as many prunes as they wanted to, and so they had to apply to the FDA for permission to rebrand themselves as dried plums, because apparently dried plums are more sellable in the grocery store because they don't sort of have the bad reputation that prunes have. So dried plums, prunes, same thing, but maybe you're willing to buy dried plums more so than you're willing to buy prunes. So that's a really good example. You all probably remember those commercials of the lady in the corn maze telling you that high fructose corn syrup was just sugar. It was just corn sugar, and sugar is sugar. That was a really big effort by that industry to rebrand sort of the negative press that they were getting for high fructose corn syrup. And they applied also to the FDA to get a change in name so that corn sugar in the federal regulations could be revised so that high fructose corn syrup would fit into there, and the FDA said no. So dried plums, okay. High fructose corn syrup equals corn sugar, not okay. And those are all things that are very highly regulated. And then you have sort of your branding, which I'm not going to take up all the time, but I think it's really interesting because there's a ton of lawsuits right now over all natural, or saying things about your product that are very fuzzy, vague, unregulated terms. So the FDA doesn't have a definition of all natural. They don't have a regulation of how much wheat do you need in your product to be able to say whole wheat or whole grain. And so things like that get really questionable. So in some states, in particular in California, there's what's called a private right of action. So that means that people can go to the grocery store, and if they think that a product says all natural and it is not actually all natural, you can bring a lawsuit against a company for that. And there's tons of those. There's anybody, okay, so who has had naked fruit juice, right? They got sued, a huge class action lawsuit. They had to take the word natural off of their product because they paid out $9 million in a settlement. Because it was not all natural, or there was some chemical component in there that made it not all natural. Bumblebee tuna fish, the little cans of tuna fish, anybody? Has anybody eaten those? Right? They got sued because they said things about the omega-3 content in their seafood. So they had to address that lawsuit. Mission tortilla chips, that's another company that got sued for saying all natural. There was a company that made milk for private labeling. So it was a milk company, and then they sold their milk to various companies like Trader Joe's and Walmart and Target, and each of those companies put their own label on it. They got also sued for saying that it was organic when there was a dispute about that. And while the court said, okay, well, organic, that's a federal statute, so you can't sue them about that. But they were allowed to proceed with their lawsuit because these milk cartons had pictures of cows in a very pastoral, natural-looking setting. And that was deemed to be false advertising because it was not an all-natural product. And the picture was deemed to be false advertising because the cows appeared to be in an all-natural setting. So there's a lot of things here, a lot of moving parts. The last one I wanted to just talk about really quickly is Pom Wonderful, which is a company that makes pomegranate juice. And it was a really big they had a huge marketing campaign over pomegranate juice, and it became very popular among consumers. And then everybody else started selling pomegranate juice. And so one of those companies was Coca-Cola, who owns Minute Maid. And they had Minute Maid pomegranate blueberry juice. And it was, I want to tell you the right percentages. It was, I think, 0.2% blueberry juice, and it was 0.3% pomegranate juice, and then it had 0.1% raspberry juice. And the label said pomegranate blueberry, like that. So Pom Wonderful sued them and said, that is not pomegranate juice. It was 99.4% apple juice and grape juice, so filler juices, they're called. And the FDA, they were allowed to call it pomegranate blueberry. So Pom Wonderful sued Coca-Cola and said that's false advertising. And it violates the federal, they said it's false advertising even though it's consistent with the federal labeling laws. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, even though it's consistent with the federal labeling laws, even though the FDA says you can do it, it can still be false advertising because it is unfair to your competitors for you to call it, it is possible for it to be unfair to your competitors for it to be called pomegranate blueberry if it only has that small of percentages. They didn't make the decision as to whether or not it was or was not false advertising, but they said you can bring a false advertising claim even if you're 100% above board with the federal labeling regulations. So all of that is just sort of food for thought, and I'll move on because I could give you